Thank you very much, Lord Mayors, Minister, Ambassador, distinguished guests. I've been 8 weeks now in my new role as Ireland's Ambassador in London, and in that time I've seen the dimensions of our relationship. Every day I see new aspects of it emerging before me and new challenges that I have to take on and try to address. But it's always difficult when you speak last and the other three speakers have taken all of your best lines. But I suppose I could always take the usual, or take the the tried and tested method of referring to what my taxi driver said to me this morning, which was, "What are you doing in Dublin Castle?" And I said, "I'm going to a conference of the cities of the Isles." And he said, "What's that?" And I explained what it was, building networks between the cities of Britain and Ireland. He said, "Will it do any good?" And I said, "I believe it will do good because there are opportunities for networking between our two islands and between the cities of our two islands, which are dynamic drivers of our economic and social development on both of our neighbouring islands." He also told me, interestingly, that he believed that this year the number of English tourists in Dublin had gone up quite dramatically, which is very good news because when I was in Germany over the 4 years I was there, the numbers of Germans coming here went up every year. So I'm hoping to emulate that feat in London, but it's a bit more difficult because there's a lot more competition in the market and so forth. But he told me, then he said to me, he said, "Do you know where they're going to now?" He said, "You know what is very popular with them?" I said, "I have no idea." He said, "Kilmainham Jail Museum." He said, "I've met lots of English people who go there to Kilmainham Jail Museum, and they come back and they say, 'Wow, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about your history.'" That's interesting as an insight into the shared histories that we're discussing here today. But this is my second time being posted on our neighbouring island, and it's a privilege to represent Ireland anywhere in the world, but it's a special privilege to represent Ireland on our neighbouring island because of the depth, the complexity and the richness of the connections between us. It's not my first time. I was Consul General in Scotland between 1998 and 2001. And I remember once visiting Glasgow, and the Lord Mayor of Glasgow in those days was of Irish descent, as they often are. And he would say to me, every time I went to visit him, which I frequently did, he would say, "Dan, you're as welcome as the flowers in May." And I'd only ever heard that phrase used before by my grandmother in Waterford decades before. And I looked up the phrase, and it comes from a song called "Dear Old Donegal." So I thought, isn't that a very good illustration now of the connection between our two countries and between Ireland and Glasgow in particular. And then I remember in Glasgow going to the Gorbals on a wet Tuesday night in February one year, and there was a whole hall of people making St. Bridget's crosses. These were all Scottish born, in many cases second, third, fourth generation connected with Ireland. But there they were, making St. Bridget's crosses. Another illustration of the connections between us. I remember once I went to the island of Islay to unveil a monument to an Irish ship that went down off the coast of Ireland in the 1840s carrying 300 emigrants from Ireland to North America. And the people of Islay buried those who drowned. And there were almost everyone on board the ship drowned, and they buried them on the beach. And 150 years later, local people decided to build a monument, and I went down there to unveil that monument. And while I was there, I visited Dublin Castle, which was the headquarters of the Lords of the Isles. And that just taught me, that beautiful place on Islay, that more than 1,000 years ago, you had these connections between Britain and Ireland, between Scotland and Ireland. And the Scottish Gaelic poet Sorley MacLean once talked about our two peoples as being sea divided. Well, there's no longer any need, in my view, to be sea divided, because the connections that are there between us now, the diversity of air routes that exist between Britain and Ireland. I saw last night in reading a report that 42% of all journeys in and out of Ireland go to Britain. 90% of all ferry passengers travel between Ireland and Britain. So there is no excuse anymore for being sea divided, and I'm delighted that this Cities of the Isles process has sought to connect the cities of Britain and Ireland in this very positive way. This conference is fundamentally about connections between cities with shared circumstances and shared interests. And it is part of a rich network that has developed impressively in recent years and looks set to evolve further in the period ahead. I just transferred from Germany, from Berlin to London, and I spent 4 years in Berlin. And during my time there, I saw the extent of the connections that Germany, including German cities, have developed with those of their neighbours whose history is fraught with such tragedy and disaster. But now, German cities and French cities, German cities and Polish cities are building connections and are rediscovering each other, and they're putting the burden of history behind them, and they're taking advantage of the opportunities that exist for connecting cities within the European Union. So geography and economic advantage is driving these links, which are vital in dealing with the burden of history. This ought to be an inspiration for us as we seek to produce a dividend from the improved relations, the vastly improved relations that exist between our two islands. I'm a historian by training, and for most of my time reading Irish history, I've been reading about a contested history, a history of conflict and struggle. And now I think more and more we can say that we have an overlapping history, a history that can now be shared, a history that I think we can enjoy sharing together. As a historian, I have encountered Anglo-Irish relations as an adversarial tale of conquest and colonization, reform and resistance. Rightly or wrongly, I've always perceived our 19th century history as a struggle to assert our separate political identity and cultural identity against the odds set by our respective size and by Britain's role as a global power. Even during the first decades of our independence, relations with Britain remained fraught, as reflected in the economic war of the 1930s and the tensions that surrounded our World War II neutrality. Ambassador Chilcot has already mentioned the factors that have caused that change to come about, to cause the positive era to be ushered in, the one that we now live in, and that enables conferences like this to look to a bright and productive and constructive future. Those elements are the peace process, the need for the two governments to work together on the peace process, our shared membership of the European Union. But a third factor that I would mention is Ireland's economic development. Because I can remember a time in the 1960s, the first images I remember were of an Irish Taoiseach, accompanied by his ministers, going to Britain, seeking concessions under the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement. I think Ireland's emergence in the last 15 years and the economic development we've experienced, which has transformed this country despite the problems we've had over the last 5 years, I think that has made us a more interesting partner. It has turned the relationship into a two-way street, not a one-way street, and it's important. And the fact that Dominic Chilcot mentioned that Ireland is the 5th biggest export market for British exports, that is a remarkable fact, and that sustains the relationship in a very positive way. I would also, and I would say that what I always called until recent times Anglo-Irish relations, I think it's a great thing that that has been replaced by British-Irish relations. I think that is in itself, it's a measure of a new era that has emerged between us, because our relations now are more complex, they're more varied. It's not just a London-Dublin connection. There's also, in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be attending the meeting of the British-Irish Council with the Taoiseach, and we'll be meeting representatives of not only of the British government, but also of the Northern Ireland Executive, of Wales, of Scotland, of the Isle of Man, of Jersey and Guernsey. In other words, it's a new era for relations, and the relations are more complex and multifaceted. And that also ought to involve closer relations between the cities of these islands, because, as I said before, the cities are engines of economic and social development. I want to mention also things that have been mentioned already, which is, I think, two things have happened in recent years which I believe have been very significant. The first is Queen Elizabeth's visit to Ireland in 2012. And I can tell you that from Irish people in Britain, I have heard direct accounts of how important that visit was to them. What's more, I have heard powerful, convincing accounts from senior British people as to how meaningful the visit was and the kind of impact that visit made on them. So that visit has definitely brushed away the last remaining clouds over our relationship, and it has ushered in, I think, a new era of relations. And the second factor was also mentioned, which is the relationship between the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister, and the important joint statement that was issued in March 2012 entitled British-Irish Relations, the Next Decade, which set out a vision of closer cooperation between our two countries and identified a range of areas in which this vision could be taken forward. The statement said that we are uniquely linked by geography and history. And I hope that the decade of centenary commemorations that we're now entering into will be used as an opportunity to advance this process of making our history more measured and more consensual. Of course, we will always have our separate perspectives on history, but at least we can have an understanding of each other's perspectives, and that is what we must be aiming to achieve over the next 10 years. Now, the two Prime Ministers commissioned a major study of our economic relations, which is intended to serve as a base for further cooperation. It was published in July of this year, and I would recommend those of you who are interested in building links between our two countries to have a look at that document, because it sets out a very comprehensive list of areas in which there are opportunities for further connections and cooperation between our two islands. In the agri-food sector, on food chain security, cooperation in agricultural trade and research, in energy, on renewable energy trading, on interconnections. And I recently attended a number of fringe meetings at the British Party conferences organised by the ESB, which is building a major power station near Manchester. So it's becoming involved in the British energy market in a big way. They also identified research and development, closer cooperation between research communities. During the week, I had the pleasure of hosting at the Embassy a dinner for Science Foundation Ireland, where they brought Irish researchers together with the Wellcome Trust, a major British charity which funds very significant quantities of biomedical research in Britain and in other countries, including in Ireland. And we were working there on trying to ensure that the Irish researchers plugged into the funding available from the Wellcome Trust. Tourism and travel was identified, the possibility of a single visa for both countries, which would make it far easier to attract tourists from long-haul destinations. Transport. So there's a whole range of areas identified in this study. And a few weeks back, I had the pleasure of attending the meeting of permanent secretaries of British ministries and their counterparts, the Secretaries General of Irish ministries. And there you had very detailed discussions of how to take forward our relationship further into a new generation, because I would say that we now have blue skies over British-Irish relations. And there's an opportunity. The opportunities in this blue sky environment are absolutely limitless. And it will be my privilege over the next number of years to assist in the development of these relations in the various areas, including connections between our cities. Now, the role of the Embassy is to foster and facilitate beneficial connections between our two countries. It's important that we see a continuation of the developing links between North and South in Ireland. That's why I'm delighted to be sharing a platform here this morning with the Lord Mayors of Dublin and Belfast and with the British Ambassador, a symbolic evidence of a new era that has emerged here in these islands and that we must take full advantage of. We also need to continue to develop relations between Britain and Ireland. There is still further potential to be explored, even though Britain is our biggest export market, it's our most important source of tourists. We can go further. We can develop this relationship further. It's also important that we do it within Europe, which is why, as the Taoiseach said in Cambridge in September, we cannot be indifferent to the debate that's going on in Britain about Britain's future in Europe, because we have a unique relationship with Britain, and therefore we will be uniquely affected by any change in Britain's engagement in Europe. And therefore, we must have the hope that Britain will continue on the European journey side by side with Ireland, as we have done so successfully for the past 40 years. So I'm keen to encourage relations, the further development of relations between our two countries. We have the blueprint, we have all of the facts, we can see now the relationship in its full dimensions, in the richness of this relationship, and the challenge for us is to take that relationship forward to the next step. And this is why I am delighted to be here today, delighted to encourage this cooperation between the cities of the Isles, and I look forward to engaging with you later today and also in the coming years during my time in London. Thank you very much.